I know there will probably be a handful more folks join us, but to be respectful of your time, we'll go ahead. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is the fourth Connecting Michigan Communities webinar that we've had, and today's focus will be on the kind of a federal update. And we're glad to have with us today Lindsay Conrad. She serves as Connected Nations Director of Public Policy, and it's just exciting to have her on today. So, Lindsay, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Wes. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well. Thank you. Lindsay, before we get started, I guess I should just a couple of housekeeping items. Throughout the day today, if you've got questions, please submit those utilizing the Q&A button in the screen on your screen. There should be on the lower portion of your screen. You have the opportunity to submit those, and that'll ensure that we have record of any of the questions that may come in. And if by chance we're unable to touch on them today during the discussion, that we are able to get back and follow up with you. With that said, Lindsay, I'd let you know that I try to do something to kind of break the ice and to let our audience know a little bit more about you. And so I've got a question that I'm going to throw at you here this morning. And so what I'm curious is I'm going to say one single word and let you respond to what that word means to you. And so the word for this morning is 2021.
2021. I think the word that comes to mind when I think of 2021 is a hopeful one, and that's vaccines. And I'm really hoping these vaccines continue to get rolled out, and everybody that can get them gets it. And I have some plane tickets to Europe in June, and for our 10-year anniversary, and I'd really like to be able to use them. So fingers crossed. But also, and this kind of leads into the topic of today, but I think 2021 also is going to be a big year for broadband, and there's just a lot of momentum at the federal level as well as states across the country. There's been, a lot of us have been tuning into State of the State addresses across the country, and broadband keeps coming up time and time again. So I have high hopes.
I was going to say, I think a lot of people probably would respond to 2021 with a single word answer of hope. Just some of us just hope to get outside again or away from our homes for more than 15 minutes. And but those are great words. I agree with you. The vaccines are going to be, it's interesting to watch the rollout this year, and for all of us as we watch our family members and whatnot gain access to those the vaccines and ourselves for that matter later this year. It's going to be exciting. So we certainly appreciate those comments.
Let me just add, Wes, that my husband's a physician and my 2 kids have had COVID. So he's vaccinated. My kids have had COVID and I'm the only one left. So I feel like, it's time. I'm ready for it. I want to join the rest of my family here.
Well, we've even got we now have folks chiming in on the chat saying yes, hopeful. So it's good. Well, Lindsay, let's go ahead and get into today's conversation and start talking about kind of this federal. We've talked about our communities over the past, I guess in the past, we had a holiday in there, but the last couple of webinar sessions that we've had, we talked about kind of what's going on with communities in the state of Michigan. Eric Frederick was on 2 weeks ago now, and he discussed what was going on kind of at the state level and what the impacts of what's happening at the state level kind of look like. And so today we have the opportunity for you to kind of talk us through some of the things that are happening at the federal level, and then we'll have some discussion that follows up with that on how it impacts the state or what our communities can be expecting, so on and so forth. So with that, I will try to start your slideshow, and I think everybody should be able to see that now.
Great, absolutely. And Wes, I'll just indicate when it's time to switch slides, and if you can help me run those, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
All right, so as we all know, there has been lots of movement taking place at the federal level, and I wanted to start off by sharing some of the broadband related items in the COVID relief package, as well as the omnibus, both of which passed late December. So to start, the COVID Relief Fund provides $3.2 billion in the emergency broadband benefit package. And this is a neat program which will reimburse providers up to $50 per month per low-income household that it serves. And for tribal areas, that number is actually $75 per month per low-income household. So I know that you all in Michigan have some tribal lands up there, and this could be meaningful for them as well. Additionally, providers may receive $100 for providing connected devices like laptops to households if the household contributes $10 to $50 for the device. And it is intended, and I think this is worth noting, that this emergency relief lasts only for 6 months after the COVID pandemic ends. And so this is not meant to be a long-term thing, but it is supposed to be something to kind of get us over this hump of the pandemic. The FCC released a public notice seeking comment on the matter. It ended the last week of January, and reply comments are due to the agency February 16th. I know MPSC filed some great comments, and we're excited to see what the FCC does with that and with all of the other feedback. The second sort of bullet point here is a program within NTIA, which is the Broadband Expansion Program. The COVID relief package carved out $300 million to be given to NTIA for this expansion program, and this will provide grants to applicants to expand service. The application and distribution method is still not defined that I've seen, and some of you all may have been on calls with NTIA and might even know more than I do on this, but we think it's going to be similar to Reconnect, and where the aim is, of course, to serve these smaller scale type infrastructure projects in very rural communities. NTIA has 60 days from the passing of this fund, which was in December, to issue a notice inviting applications. So we'll be tracking this very closely in the coming weeks. Next slide.
Lindsay, Lindsay, before we flip over there, I know you, on that first piece, the emergency broadband benefit, you said it would last for 6 months post the COVID emergency. What's the delineation, or what will that line be? You know, is that something that has to be passed, or is that executive order?
Yeah, that's a good question, Wes. And I'm not exactly sure how they're going to roll that out or how they're going to make that determination. You know, my anticipation is that the COVID pandemic ending is going to, it's going to go on for a while, right? I mean, until folks are really back to work, aren't struggling economically with the impact that the pandemic's had. So I would not expect this to be a short-term thing. I would expect it definitely to be longer term.
Sure.
All right, next slide. Okay, so also included in the COVID relief fund is funding for the implementation of the Broadband Data Act, and that's at the tune of $65 million. This is something Connected Nation is extremely excited about. We have been pushing for this Broadband Data Act or some legislation of this sort for literally years now. So as many of you all remember, just as a background, this Data Act was passed in March 2020, and it really set the stage for a sweeping reform on how broadband data is collected, verified, and of course mapped at the FCC, but it has remained unfunded until now, that is. So with these funds, the FCC can move forward towards implementing the act, and we can all certainly look forward to hopefully much better broadband data and maps in the future. The FCC released a third and hopefully final mapping order in January covering the implementation of the data collection. And in it, the FCC laid out some plans to begin working on establishing the broadband serviceable location fabric, which of course is called for in the Act. There's some development of a web-based mapping and challenge process platform. And at some level, there will be a help desk for small service providers, among several other things. The next bullet point you'll see here is $285 million, which was also made available in this legislation to create a new office. It's called the Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives. That is also going to be at NTIA. And this will be something to support historically Black colleges and universities, tribal entities, and any other minority serving educational institutions. The effort is aimed to help expand broadband capacity and use at the school and in the surrounding community around those schools. And then telehealth, $250 million is now available for the FCC's COVID-19 telehealth program. Last year, $200 million was appropriated, and this of course requires a 15% match from applicants. And then finally on this slide, and I think this is a really neat program, it's also going to be housed at NTIA. It's a $1 billion fund for tribal broadband connectivity grants. And what's kind of neat about this is that the grant program will not only allow for infrastructure development, but it can also be used for things like telehealth, distance learning, broadband affordability, and digital inclusion, among other things. Next slide, please, Wes. All right, so shifting gears slightly, as we said earlier, the COVID Relief Fund was passed alongside a larger omnibus, which also included several big broadband provisions. First of all, it establishes the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth within NTIA. And this office is going to do several things, and you'll see those laid out here in the bullet points. It's going to develop targeted broadband training and presentations for various demographic communities. That'll be a sort of a media push. It's going to develop and distribute publications, providing guidance to communities for expanding access. It will serve a big tracking role. It's going to track all this construction and use of access to any broadband infrastructure built using federal support. So that certainly will be important in ensuring we eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. And then finally, it's going to formalize the Broadband USA program and the State Broadband Leaders Network, which I believe many of you all are familiar with. I know Michigan's been involved with this SBLN group for some time. They've been operating in this sort of informal capacity, and basically it's all of these state technical kinds of folks that come together and talk about best practices in their state, what's working, what's not, to expand broadband. And I think it's been a really meaningful group, and I think that you'll see that Congress agreed with that in formalizing that Broadband USA group. There's also a Beat China to 5G Act, which was included, and that opens mid-spectrum band for 5G deployment. And it calls on the president, acting through NTIA again, to withdraw or modify federal spectrum assignments in the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band. It directs the FCC to begin a system of competitive bidding auctions. So we'll hopefully see some 5G expansion here in the next year as well. And then finally, we talked about the $65 million, which goes towards the Broadband Data Act implementation. There was also $33 million that was carved out for the Broadband Data Act. This is in addition to the $65 million in the COVID Relief Fund mentioned above. So nice total of $98 million there. Next slide, Wes. All right, I am going to completely switch gears. So we've talked about this very massive piece of legislation, the omnibus, which was coupled with this COVID Relief Fund. And now I just want to shift gears and talk about some federal funds which will be doled out to providers, hopefully very soon. And hopefully you guys will start to see some impacts in the communities where you work. So this is the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And we really believe this is going to go a long way to help unserved Michigan. Impacts will not be seen immediately, however, and we'll talk about the build out requirements shortly, but ultimately this is very good news for the state of Michigan. So a bit of background on the fund. It was established in 2019 to provide up to $20.4 billion for rural connectivity, and it's to be doled out in two phases. Phase one was set up to give up to $16 billion for providers to serve census blocks that wholly lack voice and broadband with speeds of at least 25 megabits per second. Then phase two would come about, which would be rolled out later to give funding up to $4.4 billion, plus whatever was left over from phase one for blocks that are partially served. So let me just pause there. There was a bit of controversy that you all may remember if you've been tracking any of this. The controversy was over the allotments. And as we talked about previously, broadband mapping has been wrought with error. And the Form 477 that has been previously required of providers to submit their broadband data to the FCC has big issues. Mainly if even one household in a census block has been marked as having service, then that whole block or location is marked as served, that whole block and every location in that block is marked as having served, rather. This naturally overstates coverage in a big way. So then Commissioner, and now she's the acting chairman at the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, had concerns that such a large pot of funding would be doled out in phase one before the FCC had a chance to create these better maps through the Broadband Data Act. Previous chairman Ajit Pai argued that we needed to go ahead and get the money out the door to help communities, and that phase 2 would be rolled out presumably after we had the better maps ready to go. So he argued that the maps tend not to understate coverage. If anything, they overstate coverage, was his argument. So there would not be waste, fraud, and abuse in that respect. So those were kind of the two arguments that we heard on this. But the takeaway is that phase 2 will happen, we assume, after better mapping is made available. Next slide, please. All right, so this past December, we saw phase 1 results. Nationally, those numbers were 180 winning bids across 49 states, which resulted in 5.2 million homes to be served, homes and businesses, I should say. The FCC reported that almost all of the winning bids would serve at speeds of 100/20 megabits per second, and 85% nationally would get gigabit service. The interesting part is that only 9.2 billion was actually allocated in phase 1, which of course is far short than the allotted 16 billion. The FCC chalks this up to the efficiency of the reverse auction format, which resulted in these immense savings for the commission. So what this means is that for phase 2, rather than only having $4.4 billion, they'll now have $11.2 billion to dole out. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for Michigan? 13 Michigan providers won bids in phase 1 of RDOF, and this totaled over $362 million to offer service to nearly 250,000 locations. And, I talked about RDOF in Texas recently, and they had some interest about how the state of Texas ranked nationally among other states. And actually, Michigan and Texas didn't look too different. They were both around 362 million, and their ranking was about one off in a couple of different directions. But you can see the ranks here that I included in the slide. Michigan is number 8 in terms of money allocated. They are behind California, Mississippi, Arkansas, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And then in terms of the locations to be served, Michigan ranks number 3, just behind California and Texas. So I think that the takeaway from that, in my opinion, is that the providers in Michigan are doing a good job trying to get as many locations served with the number of dollars that they're being given from the federal government. So I think that's, if you're a Michigan provider that's been involved in this, I think that says a lot. So good job. All right, RDOF winning bids in Michigan. We can go on to the next slide, please. Here's the list of winning bidders in Michigan who are getting the chunk of the change for RDOF. And you can see here the consortium of AEG and Heron Broadband. There's another consortium there, NRTC, Phase 1 RDOF Consortium, Mercury Wireless, CCO Holdings, and that is Charter Communications, I believe. The Rural Electric Cooperative Consortium, Point Broadband Fiber Holdings, and you can see the rest of them there. I'll just pause and let you guys noodle over that for a second. All right, Wes, I think we can go on to the next slide. So here's the map of the service. I know that looking at this on a tiny screen is probably very hard to make any sense of. So I've included a link at the bottom. I don't know if you can click that link now or not, but if you can't find it, it's on the FCC's website. And I would just encourage everyone, if you have interest in this, to go there, do an RDOF search, or we can share the link if you can't find it.
I was gonna say, Lindsay, I can share that link whenever I send a note out to attendees.
Yeah. Great, that would be perfect. So the areas in green there that you'll see are gigabit speeds with low latency. And then when scoring applications, the FCC did give the highest priority to gig speeds and low latency. So you'll see most of the winning awards there in Michigan are that speed. So, all right, next slide, please. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to share the next steps and build out requirements with you. before we get into the build out requirements, let me just note that post auction, winning bidders are required to fill out what's called a long form application. So they did their preliminary application, they announced the winners, and now there's a long form application. And so that will need to be filled out before funding is formally authorized. So this list could change a bit. I believe long form applications were due last week. So hopefully we'll see some authorizations coming down the pipe. And I have not checked on that. I don't know that there has been any authorization so far, but certainly correct me if I've missed it and haven't seen it. But money will be doled out over 10 years in monthly installments to providers. Winning bidders must meet certain build out requirements each year. You'll see by the end of year 3, 40% is required, and it goes up 20% each year. So year 4, 60%, by the end of year 5, 80% build outs required, and 100% by the end of year 6 there. So this is a multi-year effort to expand coverage. And while Connected Nation believes this is definitely a huge step in the right direction and will be immensely impactful, we know that state broadband offices, provider communities, public-private partnerships, governor's offices, all of these kind of broadband leaders in a state are absolutely vital to helping unserved communities in the meantime while we wait on this build out and more. So this is a very big piece of the pie, but it is a piece of the pie. So kudos to you all that are on the ground working with the state of Michigan and trying to kind of fill some of those other gaps while we wait on some more of this build out. All right, next slide, please. So we're gonna completely shift gears again and go to FCC leadership. I just wanted to point out that with the election of President Joe Biden, the makeup of the FCC has shifted a bit. And these sorts of dynamics are something that we're going to be tracking closely. The FCC appointed longtime FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, that's her picture there, to serve as acting chair last week. And currently the FCC is split 2 Dems, 2 Republicans, with 1 empty seat, which will need to be appointed by the president. This will presumably be a Democrat, giving the FCC a 3 Democrat to 2 Republican ratio. So what this means is that there may be some revived conversations around things like net neutrality, obviously a hot button issue at the FCC and in the media as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I did here on this slide is just included a quote in order to bring up the topic that is hot off the press. Just yesterday, acting FCC chair Rosenworcel said that she wants to expand the number of students who benefit from E-rate subsidies to include those attending school virtually. And this is one of those areas, as I mentioned on the last slide, that there may be some revived conversations, that maybe things were determined in the previous administration, and now the FCC may be looking to shift those a bit. So this would certainly be a reversal from former Chairman Pai's FCC. Rosenworcel's quote here: "We need to get to work to update E-rate funding so all our students can be connected to virtual classrooms, no matter who they are or where they live." So that was her statement on this. So just to touch of background quickly, the FCC's E-rate program, as many of you all are familiar and aware, it provides billions of dollars annually that helps support broadband and telecom connectivities in schools and libraries. But as the pandemic spread and the schools closed their doors last year, Republicans and Democrats fought a bit over whether the subsidies could help families pay for at-home internet devices like Wi-Fi hotspots. Rosenworcel was among those who believed that it should be allowed, but former Chairman Pai felt that the law restricted E-rate funding, E-rate spending to classrooms. So it was a legal issue. So instead, he called on Congress to address the connectivity challenges. But obviously in this reversal, Rosenworcel's FCC is changing things a bit. So the FCC is opening up comments on the subject via public notice, and comments are going to be due on February 16th, with reply comments to the FCC due February 23rd. So if you have any interest in making your voice known at the FCC, certainly reach out to Connected Nation Michigan. We can point you in the right direction on that. Next slide. Well, that's it for me, Wes.
Well, Lindsay, that's awesome. We sit here and we listen and think, and we appreciate all of that information, because I think even for me sitting here, with all that's been going on in the world, I think I even take for granted the amount of things that have taken place at the federal level over the past 3 or 4 months. When I really think about it, there's probably not been too many times when as much was going on as it pertains to broadband and technology and how it really impacts us. I can maybe only think of a couple other times over the past couple of decades here that has been the case. And so I think with just the dynamics of the world we're living in right now, it's been easy to miss some of this. And so it's really good to get it in a kind of a concise format that we can think about, chew on a little bit. And so with that, a couple of things. I haven't seen any questions coming through. There's been a couple of comments made back to us, just some notes, but no questions. So certainly make sure you're dropping those questions in the Q&A box if you've got them. But in the meantime, Lindsay, I will ask a handful and see kind of where things go. And so one of those being, how do you expect that these actions at the federal level to impact Michigan? Particularly, RDOF is something that we're all talking about a lot right now. I know that there's still some question about what this phase one will finally look like. I think providers had to go into a quiet period while they were still filing financials and things like that. So is there any, do you have any thoughts on how that impacts Michigan in the next, say, 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, well, when you said what kind of impacts do we expect in Michigan? As you were asking the question, I certainly was thinking of RDOF. I think that's huge. I think those dollars are going to go a long way, and we'll start to see some build out fairly quickly in order for them to meet their build out milestones. I also think that we will see other major things coming down the pipeline. This is a lot that we have covered today. I recognize that. Believe me, we're tracking so much. But I don't think that that's all we're going to see. I think we're going to see more. And this E-rate order is a perfect example of that, just coming in yesterday. So, if it ends up being passed and the FCC does end up being able to use the E-rate dollars for some home connectivity, then I think that will have major impacts in Michigan schools, as so many kids are virtually learning across the state. So additionally, as the FCC reworks its broadband mapping via this Broadband Data Act that we talked about, we'll be finally able to see where service is and is not in a state. As I talked about, current Form 477 reporting is wrought with these inaccuracies. So states really have had no way to fix things that they can't measure, right? And so getting the data right from the get-go will be huge for states looking to solve their connectivity challenges, because they'll be able to pinpoint specifically the areas of need.
Yeah, Lindsay, that's a good point. That's, Michigan, for many, they know, or for those that don't know, Michigan has continued to do mapping work. Connected Nation Michigan has worked on that for the past several years, and really because there's this question at the federal level about data, and certainly the process that we go through, I'll go ahead and put a plug in there. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. Ashley Hitt, our vice president of geographic information systems, will be on, and she's going to talk about just what broadband mapping looks like. And I know she'll touch base on probably what's going to look like at the federal level, or what we believe those changes are going to be, but it Michigan has kind of been on an island with a handful of other states over the past several years who have some elevated level of data that helps them make local decisions better, but it doesn't help, at the federal level, because essentially, regardless of the data that you have, the federal government has utilized that 477 information for their decision making, regardless of if that you have better information about particular locations. So yeah, it is an interesting dynamic that we've been living in, and I think with these new things coming to us from an FCC mapping perspective, it'll make it a whole lot easier for those kinds of decisions, and an understanding of how it impacts kind of at a federal level. Work that's going on locally is being impacted at a federal level, and as well as a federal decision, how it's going to really impact locally. So, yeah. Lindsay, you made mention of reaching out, making comments, and one of the questions I have is what can our audience do to get involved, to have an impact from a policy perspective? And I know making comments is one of those things, but could you talk about that a little bit, and maybe something else or anything else that might be useful?
Yeah, so well, in Michigan, you guys obviously have an amazing group of state leaders who are looking to solve challenges. And as you said, one of the best ways you can have your voice heard at the federal level is to keep an eye out for commenting opportunities before NTIA or the FCC. And then, work with the groups that you're involved in to help draft and submit those comments. Connected Nation is certainly here to help you in any way that we can. And we're actually helping to identify these opportunities for the state, and we'll continue doing that. Another thing I think that states can do and local leaders can do, and you guys are doing so much of this already, is to encourage these close relationships between providers and communities. Bring people around the table to talk and to express challenges and opportunities and to problem solve. Because collaboration, and we see this all across the country, collaboration is really the key to closing this digital divide. And like I said, I know many of you all in Michigan are already doing that via Connected and other opportunities. And keep doing that, because we just all have to come together in order to make sure that we're aware of opportunities, whether those mean federal or state funding opportunities, or just things that relationships can help bridge.
Yeah, Lindsay, there was a question that came in here that I want to make sure we touch on. And the question was, what should local, county, or community elected officials and economic development advocates be doing as the funding becomes available to facilitate these local broadband improvements? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say track it closely, figure out which provider in your community is going to be doing the build out, and build relationships with those folks if you don't already have it. If you don't already have a relationship with those guys. And I would find out, what their build out looks like, what areas in your community are going to be served. You can look at that preliminary list right now on the FCC's mapping website, which I shared a screenshot of a map previously, and just become aware and be armed with some knowledge on that and keep those relationships very warm. And, I think if you know that broadband's coming to a particular area and you have, as an economic developer, you have business prospects, sell the broadband. It's especially if you're one of those communities getting gigabit speeds. I think it's a big selling point for businesses to want to come into a community.
Yeah, and I would add to that too is as a community, look at what you're doing to make it easy for those providers to come into your community. I think we've touched on that a couple of times in past webinars, but as we have these providers and some of these providers are looking at building over the next 6 years or building these networks out over the next 6 years in 30, 40 states. What is it in your community that you can do to make it a little easier for them to go, well, we want to go build there now, rather than in year 5 of this project? Because again, it's a 6-year build. We may start seeing some of these builds in the next 6 months, but it may be that, that you're in that last 20% that's being built out year 5. And so for a local community, making sure that you're doing what you can to work with those providers, and really that comes down to relationships. And as Lindsay said, build those relationships, get to know them, have an understanding of what it's supposed to be. And as providers begin this process, we would expect, and really even organizationally, we're waiting to see more and more about what those builds are going to look like, expected areas, and is there, what's the rhyme and reason behind how they're going to build into communities for those reasons. Lindsay, trying to looking through a few of these questions. Says, my concern is that I have a relationship with most of the local providers, but how do I know if they are interested in building out? I don't think they are going to knock on my door. And that's a great question. So I think there's a couple of different things. Number one, it's important to take a look at that RDOF data. And as we said, we'll send that link around. Take a look and find out who those providers are. If you don't know them, we're certainly happy to help try to make those connections for you or point you in the right direction as to who you might contact with a particular provider. But on the other side of that is, reestablish that conversation with them about, what it would take in your community to see, broadband expanded into, especially if you have areas that you need services in, and begin to, have that conversation as a, more of a partnership conversation. You know, what can we do to work with you to make this happen in our community? You know, to be honest, in many cases, providers have built to where they can from the standard equation of broadband. And so in many cases, it's what can we do to make a change to the equation? What can our community do? What can we do to bring more people to become, you know, subscribers of the network? And so, you know, when you hear Connected Nation Michigan talk, you're going to hear us talk access, adoption, and use. And so what can we do as a community to really help with the adoption and use part of it as well? Because if a provider needs more customers to be able to make it work, you know, if we're working on providing more digital literacy programs and things like that, the chances are we're going to see greater access or greater subscribership, and therefore it makes it easier for a provider to build into particular areas. Anything that you would add to that, Lindsay?
Spot on, Wes.
All right. Let's see. I think we have a couple other questions. It says, has Michigan looked at broadband/5G technology as a transportation infrastructure, given the ability to reduce commutes if service is strong enough to conduct business reliably, therefore having DOT pay for broadband? And I'm not exactly sure who asked that question, but I know that through the Connecting Michigan Task Force, there's some conversation going on about just the various different types of infrastructure that are out there, and recognizing that rather than addressing or reviewing these things in silos, how does the state collectively look at the assets that it has, the needs of the citizenry of the state, and the residents, and just what can they do as a whole to bring to bear additional assets? And so, you know, maybe it is DOT, you know, going to go out and build networks? I don't know, but they're certainly looking at what the needs are for mobility in the future. You know, as we talk about new technologies in transportation, as we talk about new technologies across any sector, we're really looking at connectivity as a part of that. And so I don't have a lot of specifics around that, but certainly know that those are things and conversations that are taking place right now.
Also, lots of conversations around public-private partnerships too, and figuring out how we can do best practices there. So I think if we can get some of those public-private partnerships going, that can bleed into so many different parts of connectivity.
You know, Lindsay, sometimes when we hear partnership, we become averse to that conversation because we always think that's a monetary thing. And so, you know, I would encourage communities to really explore what partnerships can be with providers, because it doesn't always have to be a monetary thing. Sometimes it is, and sometimes you already have the assets that they need. They just need official access and need to be able to work with you all on those things. So yeah, I would encourage you to explore a partnership from a lot of different angles, well beyond just a monetary kind of financial arrangement. Lindsay, we'll start to wrap up here. I don't see any other questions at the moment. Is there anything that you'd want to share with anybody that we haven't discussed already?
Wes, I think we've hit the high points, but just to reiterate that I'm just so thrilled about all the money going to providers to expand some service. And as you had mentioned, this really is unprecedented to have this much that is in play in terms of broadband federally. And between NTIA and the FCC, I think big things are really going to happen for some of these rural areas. I think COVID has really shed light on the fact that broadband's a necessity like never before. And in order to keep our students learning at world-class levels, no one can be left behind. And that's why we're seeing this movement. So also, well, one final thing, I don't think I touched on this previously, but in the omnibus, there's a requirement that agencies are going to be required to work with one another to maintain consistency and to help prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. So I'm hopeful we'll see a coordinated effort to attack the digital divide, attack the homework gap, and to help serve our most vulnerable.
Lindsay, we appreciate that. And that's an interesting, you know, as we talk about just working together, seeing more and more of that at the federal level, seeing projects that work together, that aren't really competitive with one another. And you know, unfortunately, we have seen some of that in the past. So it's a great thing to point out and bring to light. I know there's been a couple of other questions that have come in the past few minutes here, and we need to go ahead and wrap up today, but I will follow up directly with anybody who has questions, and certainly feel free to reach out as per normal, and we'll try to do our best to get you the answers you're looking for or resources that you need. Ultimately, we're here to try to help you all figure out what the next steps are. I'm going to put a plug in. The Keeping Connected podcast is up and out there. I think we've got, as of this morning, 9 or 10 different episodes, I believe, that are out there now. These first episodes are all with our Connecting Michigan Task Force members, but the podcast itself will expand over time. We've got a few community leaders, and I'm certainly looking for some guests. So if you're interested in talking about broadband and technology and how it's helping your community or how it's impacting your community, please reach out. I'd love to talk with you. But certainly encourage you to take some time to jump over to the Connected Nation Michigan website and give that a listen. With that, I'll close this out. Lindsay, thanks for joining us. We'll be back here in 2 weeks talking broadband mapping in the state, and then following that at the beginning of March, we'll be talking about digital inclusion. And I think hopefully we'll continue to bring some information and resources to you that are helpful. That said, we'll close out. Thank you.